Namaskar, Jai Shri Krishna. Enlightening text 46 and text 47 of chapter 7.Scheduled Incarnations with specific functions of second canto of the cosmic manifestation of Srimad Bhagavatam. Text 46. Te vai vidantyati taranti cha deva mayam stri shudra huna shabara api papa jivaha yadyat bhutakrama parayana shila shiksha sthir yakjana api kimu shruta dharana ye. Surrendered souls even from groups leading sinful lives such as women, the laborer class, the mountaineers and the Siberians, or even the birds and beasts can also know about the science of Godhead and become liberated from the clutches of the illusory energy by surrendering unto the pure devotees of the Lord and by following in their footsteps in devotional service. Sometimes there are inquiries as to how one can surrender unto the Supreme Lord. In the Bhagavad Gita 18.66, the Lord asked Arjuna to surrender unto him, and therefore persons unwilling to do so question where God is and to whom they should surrender. The answer to such questions or inquiries is given herein very properly. The personality of Godhead may not be present before our eyes, but if one is sincere in wanting such guidance, the Lord will send a bona fide person who can guide one properly back home, back to Godhead. There is no need of material qualifications for making progress on the path of spiritual realization. In the material world, when one accepts some particular type of service, he is required to possess some particular type of qualification also. Without this, one is unfit for such service. But in the devotional service of the Lord, the only qualification required is surrender. Surrendering oneself is in one's hands only. If one likes, he can surrender immediately without delay, and that begins his spiritual life. The bona fide representative of God is as good as God himself, or in other words, the loving representative of the Lord is more kind and more easy to approach. A sinful soul cannot approach the Lord directly, but such a sinful man can very easily approach a pure devotee of the Lord. And if one agrees to put himself under the guidance of such a devotee of the Lord, he can also understand the science of Godhead and can also become like the transcendental pure devotee of the Lord and thus get his liberation back to Godhead, back home for eternal happiness. So realization of the science of Godhead and relief from the unnecessary useless struggle for existence are not at all difficult for the willing candidate, but they are very difficult for persons who are not surrendered souls but only simple profitless speculators. Text 47. Shashvat prashantam bhayam prati bodhamatram shuddham samama sadasatah parmatma tatvam shabdona yatra puru karakavan kriyartho maya paraitya bhimukhe cha विलंजमाना तदवै परम भगवतः परमस्य पुंसो ब्रह्मेति यद विदुरजस्र सुखम विशोकम. What is realized as the absolute Brahma is full of unlimited bliss without grief. That is certainly the ultimate phase of the supreme enjoyer, the personality of Godhead. He is eternally void of all disturbances and fearless. He is complete consciousness as opposed to matter, uncontaminated and without distinctions. He is the principal primeval cause of all causes and effects, in whom there is no sacrifice for productive activities and in whom the illusory energy does not stand. The supreme enjoyer, the personality of Godhead, is the supreme Brahma or the summum bonum because of his being the supreme cause of all causes. The conception of impersonal Brahma realization is the first step due to his distinct from the illusory conception of material existence. In other words, impersonal Brahma is a feature of the absolute, distinct from the material variegatedness, just as light is a conception distinct from its counterpart darkness. But the light has its variegatedness, which is seen by those who further advance in the light, and that the ultimate realization of Brahma is the source of the Brahma light, the supreme personality of Godhead, the summum bonum, or the ultimate source of everything. Therefore, meeting the personality of Godhead includes the realization of the impersonal Brahma as realized at first, in contrast with material inebriety. The personality of Godhead is the third step of Brahma realization. As explained in the first canto, one must understand all three features of the Absolute, Brahma, Paramatma and Bhagwan. Prati Bodha Matram is just the opposite conception of material existence. In matter, there are material miseries. Thus, there is the first realization of Brahma, there is the negation of such material inebrities, and there is a feeling of eternal existence distinct from the material pangs of birth, death, disease and old age. That is the primary conception of impersonal Brahma. The Supreme Lord is the Supreme Soul of everything, and therefore in the material conception affection is realized. The conception of affection is due to the relationship of soul to soul. A father is affectionate to his son because there is some relationship of nearness between the son and the father. But that sort of affection in the material world is full of inebriety. When the personality of Godhead is met, the fullness of affection becomes manifested because of the reality of the affectionate relationship. He is not the object of affection by material dangers of body and mind, but he is the full, naked, uncontaminated object of affection for all living entities because he is the super soul or Paramatma within everyone's heart. In the liberated state of affairs, the full-fledged affection for the Lord is awakened. As such, there is an everlasting happiness which is unlimitedly flowing without the fear of its being broken as we have experienced in the material world. The relationship with the Lord is never broken, thus there is no grief and no fear. Such happiness is inexplicable by words and there can be no attempt to generate such happiness by fruitive activities, by arrangements and sacrifices. But we must also know that happiness, unbroken happiness, exchange with the Supreme Person, the personality of Godhead as described in this verse, transcends the impersonal conception of the Upanishads. In the Upanishads, the description is more or less negation of the material conception of things. But this is not denial of the transcendental senses of the Supreme Lord. Herein also the same is affirmed in the statements about the material elements. They are all transcendental, free from all contamination of material identification. And also the liberated souls are not devoid of senses, otherwise there cannot be any reciprocation of unhampered spiritual happiness exchanged between them in spontaneous, unbroken joy. All the senses, both of the Lord and of the devotees, are without material contamination. They are so because they are beyond the material cause and effects as clearly mentioned herein, Sada Sataha Param. The illusory material energy cannot work there, being ashamed before the Lord and his transcendental devotees. In the material world, the sense activities are not without grief. But here it is clearly said that the senses of the Lord and his devotees are without any grief. There is a distinct difference between the material and spiritual senses, and one should understand it without denying the spiritual senses because of a material conception. The senses in the material world are surcharged with material ignorance. In every way, the authorities have recommended purification of the senses from the material conception. In the material world, the senses are manipulated for individual and personal satisfaction, whereas in the spiritual world, the senses are properly used for the purpose for which they were originally meant, namely the satisfaction of the Supreme Lord. And sensual activities are natural and therefore sense gratification there is uninterrupted and unbroken by material contamination because the senses are spiritually purified. And such satisfaction of the senses is equally shared by the transcendental reciprocators. Since the activities are unlimited and constantly increasing, there is no scope for material attempts or artificial arrangements. Such happiness of transcendental quality is called Brahma Saukhyam, which will be clearly described in the 5th canto. Hare Krishna.